Also, we want to announce that we are launching a fall Fighting Fascism series that will take place through September, October, and a little bit into November. And our first session is a banger. It will be Rachel Herzing and Robin D.G. Kelly in conversation on criminalization and the deep structure of fascism. And Chica will also drop in the chat a link for folks to sign up for that first session, which will be virtual and online. And with that, I just want to say that this is our program for the week of August 25th, 2025. Um, this week, California organizers mobilized in force to protest at the offices of U.S. Senators Alex Padilla and Adam Schiff.
In California, police arrested 138 peaceful protesters Wednesday as they occupied the lobby of Senator Alex Padilla's offices in San Francisco to demand an end to U.S. arms shipments to Israel. Among those arrested were rabbis, spiritual leaders, and descendants of Holocaust survivors. Elsewhere, Jewish Voice for Peace held protests in the lobby of a Sacramento hotel where Senator Padilla was attending a conference, and outside Padilla's offices in San Diego. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, dozens of Jewish peace activists held an hours-long sit-in protest in the offices of California's other senator, Adam Schiff. Last month, Senators Padilla and Schiff voted against a resolution sponsored by Senator Bernie Sanders and backed by 24 members of the Democratic caucus that seeks to block arms sales to Israel.
Samer, this is big actions this week. We both know that Padilla and Schiff have been staunch supporters of Israel throughout the genocide. I know you were mentioning this at a talk a couple of nights ago, and especially these ongoing arms shipments to Israel, as Nermeen Sheikh mentioned at the end there. Both senators recently voted against that measure to block arms sales to Israel, and as you can see here, both are recipients of significant amounts of Zionist lobby money, and this despite, as our friend Max Elbaum outlines in his most recent piece for Convergence magazine, the quote, massive shift that's been underway nationwide regarding support for Israel. And as Max points out in that article, polling reveals support for Israel is plummeting, including a record low 8% for Israel's military action in Gaza among Democrats. And as we've been mentioning the last few weeks on the program, the Mamdani campaign has been a crucible for these dynamics within the Democratic Party, in which establishment Democrats have joined Republicans and capitalist forces on Wall Street and the real estate lobby to partner with genocide apologists in a desperate attempt to block the overwhelming groundswell that the Mamdani campaign has been able to organize. And Max nails both the frustration and optimism, I think, of this moment in this piece, which you recommended a couple weeks ago, and I think I'd recommend again, which is that the arrests of the organizers in the Bay and LA, I think, epitomized this week. And to paraphrase him, it's infuriating that it's taken so long to get to this point, but it is a tribute to the work of everyone that's been mobilizing for Palestinian rights, and their steadfastness that this contradiction between political forces in support of and against genocide is taking place within the Democratic Party and across the body politic writ large in the United States. And it's an encouragement to intensify our efforts to combine, protest and political education on this massive scale to stop the promised escalation that Israel has made over the last couple of weeks, and the genocide in all its aspects. But speaking of testaments to the power of the movement that we've been building together, Samer, you're joining us from the second annual Conference for Palestine in Detroit, Michigan, and doing us a solid by missing the amazing plenary to help do the PSA today. So much gratitude for you, comrade. Tell us a little bit about what you and other organizers are hoping to get out of this space over the next couple of days.
Yeah, I was really keen to do a reporter on the ground kind of beat inside the plenary, but sadly not really possible to pull off. And luckily the good news is that there's nobody around because everybody's in the plenary. So hopefully that's going to make it a little easier to be able to speak. But who knows? At some point, somebody might come in and interrupt me or tell me to leave this room that I'm just squatting in. So apologies in advance if that happens. It's incredible to be here, as expected, right? What a moment, right, to be around like hundreds upon hundreds of other people that are all sort of fighting in this thing together. It's a nice reminder. You get so caught up in sort of like the insular movement work that you're doing in your own city, county, whatever. But to see the broader dynamic is really something, I think. And to see all these different organizations, working together to identify sort of a shared strategic pathway to cut off arms to Israel that is perpetuating this genocide, to uplift the dignity and liberation and respect of the Palestinian people. Like, it feels possible when you're in groups like this, right? And it feels like all the things that you've very incrementally built over these last few years suddenly feel very real. So it's a real gift to be here, and I would definitely recommend it. It'll be somewhere near the end of the slides, but when folks are done listening to us yammer, I would definitely recommend putting on the live stream of the conference if you're not here.
Yeah, thanks, Sammer. Let's have it so you can get back to what's going on there. So, floor is yours.
Thanks. I'll try to get through this quickly. Um, just got to find my thing. Sorry, I'm on a limited space. Okay, here we go. As always, there's quite a lot to cover this week. A lot of things have happened, but yeah, I think we've got somewhat of a condensed version in the slides that hopefully will get us through it quickly.
Yeah, there you go, Sammer. I'm just waiting for them to pull up, but
Yeah, are they up?
yeah, they're up now. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so just jumping right in, it has been a really brutal week in Gaza this week. The official death count is about what it was for the previous 2 weeks combined, just under 1,000 people just in the last 7 days. A lot of that is, of course, the assault on Gaza City that we're going to get into in more detail. But there's a series of strikes throughout the territory, but also not counted in this is the growing number of people who are dying from starvation, while that number continues to sort of tick up despite the relative influx of aid that has happened in the last week or so. And the Euromed Human Rights Monitor, I feel like, has done a really good job of showing the extent to which this sort of response to the starvation crisis is really insufficient, right? It doesn't really in any way meet the level of need, not even within an order of magnitude. So it's not super surprising that despite the fact that public pressure has forced an increase in humanitarian assistance, it's really nothing compared to what it needs to be. And of course, like the starvation campaign against the Palestinian people in Gaza, sort of is continuing largely unabated, despite the fact that we're in this moment of, we're reckoning with that and a sort of so-called response, both from Western powers and the Israeli government itself, that is now promising a large influx of humanitarian aid, but that isn't really materializing. We're seeing something on the order of 10 to 12 people per day dying of starvation at this point. Like the number of people who are dying from food insecurity just in these past few weeks is soon eclipsing the total number from the previous 2 years, right? And that's really telling us something about the scope of the moment. The WFP, along with other institutions, is noting that the aid that's coming in really isn't responding to this, as we mentioned, and we're seeing like the increasing scope of, we've talked about this for weeks now, right? That the way that food insecurity and starvation works is it hits the most vulnerable first, and then starts to expand out based on people's expected level of vulnerability. We're now seeing, in addition to like young children, that elderly Palestinians are succumbing to this too. And so the space of the vulnerability that's falling within this death by starvation window is just increasing by the day, unsurprisingly. Again, a predictable consequence of where we're at. I wanted to specifically point out this forensic architecture post, which, we've been featuring forensic architecture reports on the PSAs for quite some time now. This is a really particularly powerful one. Would definitely recommend folks give it a read. It really gets into the underlying structure of the starvation campaign that Israel is waging, and the sort of proof that it is a deliberate man-made starvation campaign specifically designed to do the things that it's doing. And it does a sort of comparison of how the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is operating versus the sort of more traditional, UN-based aid system, because they're both sort of operating at the same time right now. So you can see the differences in how they operate and the results and what the consequences of those modalities are. So without getting too much into this report, I just wanted to say that it's not too long. It's beautifully graphically represented and things. So definitely recommend giving it a read and sharing it around. The other, of course, I would say big headline grabbing news this week from Gaza is the hospital strike, which, made it through the sort of, broader media filters in terms of people not paying attention to what's happening in Palestine, because not only was it, live streamed and captured in footage, but also just the sheer gall of it. This is another one of those things that we could honestly spend the entire hour talking about, but, the very quick and dirty version is that this corridor, the stairwell of the hospital, which had been used as a primary communication spot for journalists throughout this entire, these past couple of years. They huddle in this one stairwell where there's access to internet to be able to send out their broadcasts. That specific spot got hit both by a drone and by a tank in what's frequently called a double tap. Meaning you bomb a spot, you wait for rescuers to show up, and then you bomb the rescuers. And that's exactly what happened here. In fact, it was a triple tap, which is a thing that, hasn't really gotten much coverage, but there were 3 strikes, the original one and then 2 in rapid succession, which, doesn't really make a huge difference in terms of if you're double tapping already, it's clear what your intentions here are, but it just really goes to show the intentionality behind what's going on here, where, this was clearly designed to do specifically the thing that it did, right? And 5 journalists and a bunch of other people were killed within these strikes, most of them in that second and third attack. And we saw the sort of usual evolving Israeli narrative response, where initially they were just yeah, we conducted this operation. And then when they saw the level of blowback, they issued the statement saying that they were targeting what they called a Hamas camera. And somehow the idea that, first of all, cameras can be Hamas now, apparently. But that being the justification for killing 22 people in a strike to get a camera, obviously didn't really produce the PR turnaround that they were hoping for. And so in response to that, they then went on a third level of lying and put out a list of I think 6 or 7 they call, Hamas terrorists that they were targeting in the strike. Again, total nonsense, right? They produced this list that actually has nothing to do with what happened in that spot. Several of the people listed there had been killed in previous operations, and other ones weren't even, are either continue to be operating at large and were not, in fact, at that site. So just pure nonsense propaganda that, of course, just gets gobbled up by the traditional media, and which is why they're able to do things like that, right? Because there is no accountability for statements like this, despite the fact that they're so obviously false. And this is particularly galling because you've got all of these news outlets, right? AP, Reuters, who have reporters on the ground who were killed in this strike. And even those institutions whose own reporters were murdered on live camera are repeating the Israeli talking points about what the underlying reason was for the strike, despite having visible evidence, not only through the cameras, but from their own employees, that isn't the case, right? And their willingness to sort of kowtow to Israeli narrative dictates as opposed to their own staff is really telling, I think, about the extent to which this is a really important battlefront in terms of changing the media narrative, but also the how hard it is to disrupt the way that Israeli media continues to sort of control how that stuff gets communicated. The other big thing happening in Gaza is, of course, the assault on Gaza City, the attack and flattening of Gaza City, as it has been described by the Israeli military themselves. It's worth noting that like the big ground offensive, for all intents and purposes, still hasn't started, and it's not really clear when it's going to start. But the like aerial bombardment and shelling and targeted incursions into Gaza City is in fact ongoing. So, as I mentioned right at the top, that's where we're seeing a lot of the cost in human life right now of Palestinians in Gaza is in Gaza City, where even the New York Times is reporting the extent to which they're doing again what they said they were going to do, which is to turn Gaza City into another Rafah, basically to just demolish whatever structures exist and flatten it. And we're already seeing, for example, in the Zaytun neighborhood that's exactly what's been going on. A big part of this, is just petty destruction, right? The idea, the genocidal intent of removing the ability for Palestinians to return to Gaza City. This is part and parcel of the general's plan that we were talking about last year that continues to sort of be implemented in bits and bobs. It's also a product of the fear of IDF soldiers of going into an area like this, where a ground incursion puts them at risk of actually having to do like one-on-one fighting, which they're terrified of, and would rather just destroy the entire city to reduce the risk to IDF soldiers engaging in these assaults. So, the so-called last bastion of Hamas, which is, I've lost track, but I believe is the seventh now description of the last bastion of Hamas that Israel needs to go in and eradicate, starting with Rafah a year and a half ago. So, the idea that this in any way is an end game is just more nonsense that the Israelis throw out, but not super surprising. The response of the IDF to this Gaza City incursion, though, is particularly interesting, and there have been a few really interesting stories on this, particularly this one, this New York Times story on the left, about Israel's exhausted soldiers complicating plans for the Gaza assault. And it gets into a surprising amount of detail from a number of different people who were drafted up for service, either people who are returning for another tour of duty or the reservists who have been called up, basically being like, no one wants me to go to this. All of my family and all of my friends think that this is a lost cause and we're losing. I'm not sure what we're doing here. And no one thinks of me in Gaza as being heroic. They all think that it's horrible. Like, the extent to which no one wants to be part of this anymore, including the existing military apparatus of Israel, is really very telling. So it's definitely worth a read. As is almost always the case, the New York Times buries the most interesting pieces about this and the most damning towards Israel all the way down near the end, where it really gets into some of the details around Israel's refusal to do anything to sort of reduce, the likelihood of this war, and their reticence to engage in any of the ceasefire collaborations and things like that. But yeah, definitely worth checking out. And then in terms of what's been going on with the ceasefire, there frankly haven't been much updates in terms of the proposal itself that we've been talking about for a few weeks on the PSA. I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago now that Hamas mentioned that they were agreeing to the terms of the ceasefire that had been negotiated, right? So, over this past, I don't know how long, right? Like since the last cessation of hostilities at the beginning of the year fell apart, the positions have largely been that Israel wanted another temporary, limited agreement that would release some hostages in exchange for a limited cessation of hostilities. And Hamas was pushing for a comprehensive agreement that was like, no, let's end the conflict and let's figure out a way to get Israel to withdraw from Gaza for a full agreement, basically. And this entire time, the Israeli government had been saying, no, only a partial agreement. We won't agree to that. There will only be a partial agreement. This past month was Hamas finally saying, hey, okay, fine, we'll do the partial agreement based on, some assurances from the other parties that it would lead to a longer settlement. And now the response of the Israeli government is, we're not interested in any partial agreements. We'll only do a comprehensive, final agreement. So they've done a perfect 180 flip here obviously because they have no interest in signing anything one way or the other, right? These are just talking points to delay the ongoing, like, what they want to do is to continue the military assault on Gaza. So given that the ceasefire agreements are largely dead, and we talked about this in the last PSA, I think, that was discussing this, that Hamas had agreed to those terms, and it seemed largely a performative gesture to show that the Israelis wouldn't agree, and that's exactly what happened, right? That is exactly the way that this played out. So now, in absence of that, it seems that Trump and a series of like high-level Israeli officials, including like the envoys being sent from Netanyahu, have been talking with the genius minds of Middle East analysts, Tony Blair and Jared Kushner, two people who are famous for their great takes on in advancing the U.S. interests in the Middle East broadly. Basically trying to run a bunch of different ideas by Trump. This is as it's described in the article. Run a bunch of different ideas by Trump to see what he's interested in and what he might be willing to promote in terms of like a settlement agreement that they can then present to Israel and be like, look, this is it. This is the end game. Like, you need to declare victory and say that you won, and these are the terms under which you're going to do it. It's not clear whether they'll agree to do something like that or not, but this seems to be the new push from the Trump administration to bring this to an end because, again, this doesn't look good for him either. And so there is, I think, more of an interest within the U.S. administration than the Israeli one to actually close this out, and a desire to avoid this assault on Gaza City to the extent that it can be. Whether or not anything is actually going to come out of that, it's a little bit hard to say. And even if it did, whether it's anything that has any meaningful impact on how the like actual dynamics on the ground, like will they come up with something that is amenable to the like Gaza resistance factions that are on the other side of those negotiations? Doubtful, right? It's extremely doubtful. And this is really early stage stuff, but all the Trump people are saying that the war, as they call it, will be over by the end of the year. And that's 4 months away. So whether that's just hot air or there's some plan to like force it to come to an end, it's a little early to tell, but this does feel like a key moment for figuring out whether or not that's going to happen. And it's going to be a bit of a, reading the political moment where I do think plummeting support for Israel in the U.S. does mean something in that particular respect. A little more stuff on like the U.S. plan for what, the so-called day after plan of thinking about what Gaza would look like when this phase of the genocide ends. There's, again, very little here. It's mostly just hot air. But it's worth noting that there are competing plans here. So while the U.S. is pushing this, sort of Israeli-coded plan for a, Arab-led, whatever non-PA government to take over Gaza, Egypt is sort of doing the opposite, right? They're training up a bunch of forces, Palestinian forces, basically, to like militarily control Gaza, basically as an extension of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Again, whether that actually happens or not is an open question. And if the Israelis and the Americans who are writing all of Israel's checks, who are writing all of Egypt's checks, don't agree to it, then it's not going to move anywhere. Obviously, it's also I feel like maybe I've lost track of the number of times we've talked about on the PSAs these plans of like, oh, let's arm and train a moderate group of like military forces to serve as a counterweight for the radical forces that we don't like, and it's going to meet the exact same fate as the other dozen times like external parties have tried to do something like that. So again, a sort of meaningless gesture, but one that's floating in the ether right now. Very quickly on the West Bank, just to note, a series of really devastating raids in Nablus, and like a few other spots across the West Bank right now where a number of people were arrested, several were killed, and a bunch were kidnapped. But also all of this happening, of course, under the looming shadow of this new Israeli settlement in the E1 area, that's supposed to be the so-called death knell of the Palestinian state because it chops off Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank and it chops the West Bank in half. That settlement hasn't been built, right? It's just been approved, but even the possibility of it actually being constructed is causing a lot of concern. So figuring out what's going to happen with that and the extent to which it's going to change the underlying dynamics, I think is something that, requires a continued vigilance, right? We talked last week about how this settlement in particular and the West Bank annexation policies generally are creating the conditions for a massive uprising, right? Like a new military front against Israel in the West Bank. So whether or not that is the logical consequence of that is something that we need to keep our eyes on. Speaking of training up moderate Arab forces, the big plan, currently going on in Lebanon right now, of course, is this fight over UNIFIL, right? The United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, which was put there during the Lebanese Civil War back in the 80s. UNIFIL's mission, it's worth noting, when it was founded, was specifically to oversee the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, right? So when Israel invaded Lebanon back in the 80s, UNIFIL was formed basically to help when Israel was supposed to be leaving the country. And so, like UNRWA, this is a UN agency that Israel sort of has this existential anger towards and has been trying to get it shut down for a really long time. Now, with the Trump administration and whatever, they're all working hand in glove. The US is basically forcing UNIFIL to shut down. And because they have veto power over the extension of the UNIFIL mandate, it looks like that will in fact be happening. So in a very typical fashion, the other countries in the Security Council, including the other like Western European countries, all wanted UNIFIL to stick around. The US said no. And so, the US basically demanded that they be shut down within a year. And so they talked and they compromised and they debated and whatever. And France came up with this new compromise solution, which is that, okay, we'll completely shut down UNIFIL, but we'll add 4 months first. So we'll make it 16 months instead of 12. And thank you. What a great compromise. So now UNIFIL will be basically, I don't think the vote has happened yet, but I could be wrong. But there doesn't seem to be any other way that it would go. So it looks like the UN interim force in Lebanon, all the UN military posts, which, if folks remember, were a really big problem for Israel when it was invading Lebanon a couple of years ago, those are all going to be removed. And so the one international force that was specifically designed to get Israel out of Lebanon will no longer be there. And there is in the resolution some language also saying that they encourage Israel to just decide themselves to leave the territory, which I'm sure they'll do any day now. And that, like the Lebanese armed forces should be taking over security in southern Lebanon, which of course means nothing at all because we've seen what the Lebanese armed forces do when Israel invades their country. It was this, by the way, that Tom Barak was getting really upset about in the interview where he called Lebanese journalists animalistic and told them to act more civilized in a way that just, the perfect encapsulation of the colonial attitudes on display here. In Syria, the furthest, deepest incursion yet of Israeli special forces into Syria, where they took over an air defense base just 6 miles from Damascus, along with a series of airstrikes that are killing Syrian soldiers, like the security forces operating under the current Syrian government. So always good to note things like this because I continue to meet Syrian politicos and other folks who are involved in some way or another with what's going on in Syria, who somehow continue to believe that if they just keep their heads down and don't anger Israel, that Israel will leave them alone. And literally every single week proves that that assumption is a wrong one and there is nothing you can do to appease Israel. You would think that lesson would be learned, but no, right? It continues to be the case that while the Syrian government tries to appease Israel, Israel continues to attack, invade, and murder members of the Syrian government. Surprise, surprise. A series of mutual strikes with Yemen this week, where Israel carried out some pretty horrific assaults during a large gathering of the like Houthi government areas while they were like conferencing together. But also at the same time, Yemeni, like Houthi missiles are still being sent towards Israel. There was, I think, 2 in the past week one that hit near Jerusalem and another one that was shot down just yesterday, I think. So just to say, like, that ongoing bombardment campaign, as with all the other ones, isn't really accomplishing anything other than taking human life and further destabilizing broader dynamics. Um, the UN Security Council is, making some noise about the famine, and it's worth noting that literally every single member of the UN Security Council um, is calling it a man-made crisis, basically saying that Israel is directly responsible for this famine, which is duh, but of course the US refuses to acknowledge that fact, at least in terms of its like official prognostications. So similarly, we're seeing like, UNICEF and other UN agencies talking about this game of trying to pretend that the hunger and starvation in Gaza isn't as bad as it's being made out to be, and just like the really kind of disgusting, racist, colonial, whatever discourse or like orientation behind statements like that. The new thing that came out just today, actually, that I didn't have a chance to put out into the slides, is that the IPC, the international body that determines levels of food insecurity, which, by the way, has been dragging its feet for weeks, right, in terms of declaring this level 5 famine in Gaza, because the information that it has access to is really limited, right? And because of that, they've taken a very, very conservative approach. And even though they probably could have declared a level 5 famine like a month ago, right? They only did it last week. Israel is filing a formal request for them to reverse the classification. Not really based on anything, but again, just like trying to muddy the waters of what's happening here. And that won't go anywhere. But the fact that there continues to be this argument about whether starvation is even happening in Gaza, I think is just a really horrific thing. I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about the Democratic Party and where it's at in this moment, and this sort of like continuing split between its base and its leadership. If folks didn't read the interview with the Biden administration's ambassador to Israel in the New Yorker, I cannot recommend highly enough that you read it, although make sure that you have a nice cup of tea in front of you or something, because you will want to smash your screen. It's unbelievable what the things that come out of this person's mouth in an interview that they knew everyone would read. Like, he gets into this whole thing about how the casualty numbers that are being reported of Palestinians being killed in Gaza aren't really accurate, because a lot of the people who died are family members of militants. And he's like, they're the children of militants. And Isaac Jodner, the New Yorker journalist, who's not exactly a radical, is like, I'm sorry, you're saying that the children of fighters, like, that it's okay to be killing those people? And he's basically like, yeah. And so remember, this is like the Biden administration people, and it really just goes to show, right, the how little is different between like the Trump administration's orientation towards what's happening and what was happening under Biden. Definitely worth a read, and definitely worth sharing with folks who, are still trying to pull the like, oh, if Kamala won, like, we wouldn't be in this situation. Like, no, yeah, we definitely would be. At the same time, at the DNC, there were a couple of resolutions being put forward around the Democratic Party's official stance on Palestine and Israel generally. There was one calling for an arms embargo and the recognition of a Palestinian state, which had the support of the overwhelming majority of Democrats. And so obviously it failed miserably. And then the like official kind of insider party resolution, which was meant to be the counterweight to that, which contains none of that language, was then pulled as a sort of gesture to the broader base to be like, okay, we know that people hate this resolution that we were going to pass because it just talks about like, our friendship with Israel and blah, blah, blah. So that like small gesture of, acknowledgement of how unpopular the position of the Democratic elite is in this situation. But the fact that they're still unwilling to really move on something that is so in line with the overwhelming majority of their base is very, very, very telling. we're seeing indications of it, by the way, including like, this really incredible scoop about Richie Torres, who has gotten millions of dollars from AIPAC, and gave a really wild interview this week. If folks didn't see it, would definitely recommend that you do. But also this story came out about how Richie has been sort of like war profiteering by investing in the arms makers that he's like voting to give money to in order to support Israel. Just really, really horrific stuff. But would definitely recommend checking out that interview. I can't remember who it's with. It's with a Jewish American comedian whose name currently escapes me. But just the level of like the complete lack of empathy that he shows when the interviewer is just talking about like all of the death and destruction and suffering that's happening to people in Gaza. Like you can just tell he does not care at all, at all. At the same time, I think like it's worth pointing out the shifts that are happening because they are quite meaningful. This Intercept article getting into the number of Democrats that have been really big AIPAC recipients that nevertheless feel like they have to sign on to block the bombs and refuse to take any more AIPAC money is really quite telling. It's an incredible shift that we're seeing, and like the extent to which folks are finally responding to the level of pressure being put on them and realizing that they're, the hope that like anger about what's happening in Gaza would die down has clearly not played out, and that if they don't shift, they are at risk of losing their seats. And that's really something, right? It really is, I think, speaks to the power of this movement and what it's been able to do. And on the ground, we've been seeing a lot of that. Thomas mentioned at the top, the actions at Padilla's office and Schiff's office that happened, a couple of days ago, including the arrest of AROC's ED, Lada Kiswani, at that event, along with 137 other people. I saw a few of you all there, by the way. There were a number of PSA watchers at the Padilla office once, so it was lovely to see some of you in person. As well as some really powerful actions at the Microsoft office, which resulted in this like really bizarre PR response where they did this. The CEO of Microsoft did this like press conference sort of thing while sitting on the side of his desk, promising to do an investigation into Microsoft's ties to Israel, which again is not a thing we would have seen before, right? So speaking to this real movement that's happening right now. The counter reaction to some of those protests has been particularly fascinating this week. Wanted to pull out a couple of them, including the decision in Beverly Hills this week that in order to counter the rise in anti-Semitism, all Beverly Hills public schools at every level will be displaying the Israeli flag next year for the entire month of May as a something, I guess. I don't know. A way to respond to anti-Semitism, which again, this sort of conflation of the state of Israel with all American Jews, despite the wild unpopularity among American Jews of what Israel is doing, I think is really something, right? Like it's hard to see this as anything other than an acceleration of anti-Semitism, but what can you do? Meanwhile, the sort of continued push to get AB 715, this school censorship bill that has been pushed by Scott Wiener and a series of very hardline Zionist assembly members and state senators, and continues to flounder because it is being opposed by everybody, by teachers unions, by school boards, whatever. The fact that they're this deep on the defensive and like putting out statements saying like, oh, people are calling this a Project Esther bill, but it's not a Project Esther bill, is like, when you have to say things like that, you're not in a good place, right? Like you're losing the fight pretty badly when this is the sort of discourse that you have to put out, because you have to recognize the fact that you're implicitly acknowledging that that is how everyone sees this bill. And the fact that the bill language specifically says calling Israel a settler colonial state is a punishable offense, it's like, yeah, buddy, this is very clearly a Project Esther bill, but nice try. The other big sort of protest update this week, of course, is the new campaign being launched by PYM, USCPR, and AROC Action based on the fact that the Oakland airport has been discovered to be one of the main hubs by which the Israeli Air Force is sourcing its F-35 program. I think like the second highest number of shipments of military equipment related to F-35s is coming out of the Oakland airport. They're sending multiple shipments per week, and they've been sending multiple shipments per week for we don't know how long now. Just horrific, horrific stuff, all through FedEx. But it is gaining a lot of media traction. There will be, I think, some really important campaign work coming out of this, as well as a really clear clarifying moment, right? Because we are in this kind of strange space where everyone is now like against what's happening in Gaza, but like some people are trying to do it from a liberal Zionist perspective, and some people are trying to do it from an actual sort of like liberationist perspective. And this is like a, for all the, Scott Wiener, like 6-person, I love Israel but don't like what they're doing in Gaza, press conference kind of things that he's trying to pull. Like, okay, well, here's a chance to actually do something, right? Like, if you actually cared, this is an opportunity for every single local elected to do something, right? Like, literally, the carriages that are holding the 2,000-pound bombs that have been dropped on Palestinian refugee camps are being, if not manufactured, shipped at least from Oakland. And so, like, there needs to be, do you want to try to stop that? Is there going to be some sort of arms embargo? Is there some engagement with the Port Authority to stop this, right? And if anyone isn't willing to do that, that should be extremely, extremely telling about whether or not they actually care about Palestinian lives in Gaza and the wholesale slaughter that is being accelerated by U.S. weapons. So a lot to talk about there, but we'll get to it, I think, in future weeks. And as always, I just wanted to close out some polling. Every time I find new polling, I get really excited and want to share it with you all. This one is from Quinnipiac, which shows new record lows of U.S. support for Israel, particularly, of course, among self-described Democrats, where the number of Democrats that sympathize with Israelis is down to 13%, and the number that sympathize with Palestinians is now at almost 2/3. Also, most independents support Palestinians, which is pretty incredible. 2/3 of Democrats say that the U.S. is too supportive of Israel. 3/4 of Democrats oppose sending military aid to Israel, including these shipments that are coming out of the Oakland airport. And half of all people in the U.S., including more than 3/4 of Democrats, think that Israel is committing a genocide. So again, like this disconnect between the base and the ostensible leaders of that party speak to this sort of like democratic fissure moment. And we've talked about this so many times, right? The clarifying function, the way in which answering this Palestine question fits into this much broader narrative about like what kind of society we live in, right? And the extent to which the systems we have here are in any way accountable to the actual people base. So pushing on these things is not only important for Palestine, right? But it's important for people here too, in terms of, shedding light on the contradictions of the so-called democratic systems that operate here and forcing more accountability and pushing out this like ossified set of leaders that have no accountability, right? And no desire to represent actual people and their interests. So always good to remember that, I think. So just to sum up, I was trying to be quick today, but I failed. The Gaza City assault is ramping up pretty significantly, but it does seem like the IDF is dragging their feet in terms of the actual full-on assault, either because they're scared to do it or they don't want to do it. Time will tell, but pressure to stop it, I think, really is critical in this moment. Meanwhile, this sort of starvation campaign is increasing the marginalization of Israel, but everyone seems to be aware of that, right? Now it's just a question of like, what can they get done before sufficient public opinion turns, and this seems very clearly to me to be the sort of underlying strategy. The way that I heard it described by somebody else that I found very compelling is a pre-land acknowledgement, right? Basically being like, oh yeah, like people are going to be really against this, and in 20 years when we've accomplished everything that we wanted to accomplish and ethnically cleansed Palestine and whatever, we can be like, yeah, wasn't it horrible that thing happened? And we don't want that outcome, right? It's not good enough for people to realize after the fact that this was wrong. um, it needs to be stopped now, right? And this is a moment of flux where public opinion and political fortunes are changing trajectories as a result of what's been happening. And so it's really, really critical to accelerate the change in that trajectory and to make sure that there's accountability, right? That like there is a political price to be paid for not moving now, yesterday, not 2 weeks from now, not 6 months from now when it's too late. Um, yeah, and then like, the collapse of the ceasefire talks is what's creating this new like Trump end game thing that's supposed to come out by the end of the year, but I wouldn't put too much stock in that either. It'll be interesting to see what it is. And then lastly, just as we were just talking about, these sharpening contradictions are helping us draw this line um, between people who are moving things forward and people who are enabling this genocide to continue, and things like this campaign about the F-35 equipment and local legislation like the fight over AB 715 and whatever, I think are really powerful ways of delineating those contradictions and holding people accountable in those ways. Uh, and we're seeing, people try to shift in response to those things, but they're not shifting enough. And this is such an easy way to be like, look, the fact that you're not willing to engage on these things shows that you're not doing enough. So those present really important opportunities for us. In terms of upcoming events, the only thing that I want to highlight is when you get off of this thing, please do check out the live stream of the People's Conference for Palestine. This was the opening plenary that I was watching in the few minutes before we started with Chris Smalls. Even the 10 minutes I saw was extremely powerful. So you can watch it all on YouTube. Would definitely recommend that you do so. And in terms of other events, please do check out the AROC calendar. You can go to bit.ly/Gaza events for upcoming actions and other types of things. If you want text updates, please text PSA to 833-633-0604 for both PSA updates and general mobilizations. And then if you want more information on the articles that inform this analysis, you can always check out the PAL Media Tracker. You can sign up for a weekly digest of stories at the palmediatracker.com/sign up. And that's it. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Summer. So much good organizing going on and so much left to do. So much organizing that's helped to create these contradictions. I don't think this happens without the research that goes into revealing what's going on. And then, of course, the pressure as evidenced by the actions that took place in Padilla's office and that will continue over the next weeks and months. We are going to sign off relatively soon so folks can get onto that live stream and also so Sammer can get back to the conference. But we'll be off next week due to travel schedules, and we'll try to be back the following Friday. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and we will see you soon.